I'll be talking about George Campbell Hay, as you said, a multilingual poet, and focusing in a rather crude way, I know, but on his use of languages in his poetry. Um, as one of our possibly the major multilingual Scottish poet, although obviously we also have William Neil, who wrote in all three of our Indigenous languages. And then more recently, Naus MacNachgal also. But to concentrate on George Campbell Hay, um, his background, in case you're not aware, so he was from Kintyre, specifically Tarbert Lochfine. And although he spent most of his life in Edinburgh, Tarbert, Kintyre remained his lodestar, as it were, both I think psychologically, emotionally, and in his poetry. Not simply as the place from which he came from, but as the cradle of Gaelic culture in Scotland. Um, Trying to get this to move on. Here we go. So here's a photo of Tabart in just shortly before he was born. He The main thing to note is that in Tarbert in Kintyre, he eventually, at quite a young age, picked up Gaelic. This language situation was that Gaelic was still spoken by the older population, but being heard less and less, and certainly people of his generation would not have spoken Gaelic. Um, so he's quite unique in that respect. Um, However, he did it through his young years, into his teenage years. He had some Gaelic in the family, and his mother was a Campbell from Islay. And although she wasn't fluent in the language, she still had a foot in the culture, as it were, and a great awareness of the language. His father, John MacDougall Hay, was the Hays were originally from Ayrshire, who then moved to Kintyre, moved to Tarbert in the mid 19th century. Presumably they would have picked up the language, they would become bilingual for one or two generations before losing their Gaelic. But the Hay side was his lowland side, as it were, and he claimed his Gaelic side through his mother's side with the Islay connections. And in Tarbert, he also had great aunts who had the language. To what extent they were willing to speak it in front of other people is another matter, but they certainly had the language and were willing to answer his questions about the language. And also the older fishermen with whom he mixed. He was out fishing in his teens and early 20s, most autumn fishing seasons. And these men would have mostly spoken Gaelic to each other and were prepared to speak Gaelic to him. So he acquired Gaelic at a very young age. As I say, he moved to Edinburgh, and I'm showing this photo just to flag up his educational background. So around the age of 10, he started attending private school in Edinburgh. That led him to Fettes College and then to Oxford. So his background educationally was in classics. And if you want, in elitist Anglo-Scottish education. But what he gave his work was he developed an extraordinary ability to pick up languages, but also an extraordinary sensitivity to registers, to literary voices, to literary traditions. And this obviously has been across various classical traditions, Greek and Latin, but then extending as his interest expanded to Icelandic, Scandinavian countries, and as we'll see in the course of the war, to other cultures. So this has been something that certainly would have been nurtured by his education, however much he in some ways wished to turn his back on that side of his background. Also, just to flag up then his position within the younger members of the second, third wave of the Scottish Renaissance, his links with Hugh McDermott, who picked up on him as a young up-and-coming poet writing in all three languages. His links with F.G. Scott then, who put some of his early English, mostly, and Scots lyrics to music. And essential here is the role of Douglas Young that Hay met in Oxford. They overlapped for, I think, 2 years. And it was Young really who I think introduced him to A Drunk Man, to the work of Hugh McDermott, I think also then eventually put him in touch with Sir MacLean. So Douglas Young was a hugely important uh, element in creating this Scottish Renaissance network. He also, I think, advised, certainly encouraged and advised Hay in his use of Scots. Um, Initially, the Scots his Scots poems were initially, I suppose, you might even say Tarbert English, a kind of Highland English, heavily influenced by Gaelic. Um, and then fairly quickly he starts shifting his use of Scots to a broader, um, a deeper Scots. And I think Douglas Young had a part to play here. And of course, not forgetting Douglas Young's role as a translator or transcreator of Hay's poetry and, of course, the great Sir MacLean's Gaelic poetry too. So swiftly moving on, these are the works in which the bulk of his work appeared. This would be his work from basically mostly the late 1930s to 1948. In 1948, he enters the Royal Edinburgh Psychiatric Hospital where he stays for 12 years, and there's no writing from that period. Even though the third book here on the Ceathair Harstin from the Four Arts appears in 1952. All this is work till so late 30s, the war period, and the immediate post-war period. So we have two volumes in Gaelic and one volume in English and Scots. A much later Gaelic volume is Mrochtaras Dúil, a long narrative poem composed in the war period, but which only surfaced in the 1980s. And just to, as I said, he was in hospital up till 1960, and then even during the 60s, again, he re-entered the Royal Edinburgh. There's a lapse in his writing and in his presence, if you want, on the scene. But in a way, what puts him on the literary map, again, are these anthologies. Gordon Wright's Four Points of Saltire, and you'll see William Neil in that book as well. And the selection there very much highlighted his multilingualism, poems in Gaelic, Scots, and English. A few years later, Robin Lorimer's No of Arthur Gaelic focuses on the Gaelic output, and basically that book very much established some of the canon, if you want, of modern Gaelic poetry in the 20th century, and particularly his war poems and nature poems probably is the core of the canonical works, if you want. And this was, of course, republished by Canongate as a Canongate classic. And eventually funded again by the Lorimer Trust came the collected poems and songs of Campbell Hay. Okay, but going back to the three initial volumes, what do we have here? Four and Slave in Gaelic, 33 Gaelic poems. Wind and Lochfine, you see a mixture of English, almost equal English and Scots. And then the appearance of French poems. These are composed during the war while he was in Algeria for the most part, certainly in North Africa, and one Norwegian poem. Just to note here, because I'll probably forget to say so, English very much recedes from his output after this early period. Resurfaces slightly towards the end of his life, but Scots takes on a much more important place in his output. On the Ceathair Harstin, again, so this very much is a Gaelic collection, and as we'll see in a minute, half of that book is actually transcreations, so recreations of other literatures, Arabic and European literatures into Gaelic, taking a prime place in that collection. And just mention passing a very slight but significant playfulness, if you want, with language that we see very early on is his use of putting poem titles in a different language from the actual poem. And probably the most significant one here is the English and Scots poems, the early poems about Kintyre, with Gaelic titles. And obviously this is a kind of reminder, reminding his lowland readers or non-Gaelic readers that the underlying Gaelic culture in Kintyre. Very quickly, another in passing, we have, for example, Italian titles. For example, in Esta Selva Selvagia, his great war poem in English, maybe his greatest English work, I reference a quote from Dante's Inferno, which is also referenced in the metrics of the poem. Okay, as I say, this is very crude. The numbers are not particularly important, but gives you an idea of how he's using language, creating in language. This is his post-1960 output, which comes in three phases, a very short phase, 60-61. The rest of the 60s, he's again in hospital, not writing apparently. Late 60s, 70s, we have a resurgence of activity. As you'll see, Gaelic really is most prominent, but Scots starts in the 70s, gaining ground, as it were, and a very strong presence in his last period in the early 80s, with almost equal Gaelic and Scots. And maybe although I say original poems, it's probably fair to say this is very crude because a large number of the Gaelic poems in the last period, in the 80s, are in fact recreations of older Gaelic songs. So he's, as we're re-entering the oral tradition in Gaelic, and in draft form, usually, spending a lot of his energy in recreating much older Gaelic songs. So to what extent you want to call that original is another matter. You'll see him again dabbling, experimenting in other languages in the 70s, Norwegian, Italian, others. Very briefly, then his trans creations, so going to other literatures, bringing them into Scots and Gaelic and English. In his first collection, very small, but much more significant in Wunderlich Fein and O na Ceathair Arstin. And we'll see the breakdown of the languages. These are the target languages shown here. Gaelic, English, English, Scots, Gaelic as the target language of his translations. I'm trying not to use translations because he equally had prose translations of his Gaelic poems. So I'll leave this up. I say very crude, but quite an interesting breakdown of the literature he introduced, brought into Gaelic and Scots and English, primarily Italian. There's this mostly from the war era, consisting of Petrarch's sonnets, and especially Cecco Angelieri, who's a kind of younger contemporary of Dante, from Siena, some of his sonnets into Gaelic, and I think most successfully into Scots. That's most the 11 Scots translations you see there. Also quite high in Irish. There's quite early material that he brings to the attention of English speakers, English readers, and his Gaelic readers as well, bringing in the cousin culture, the cousin language. Greek, modern Greek, I mean by this. Yeah. Again, this is during the war period. He spent time in Greece, having been in North Africa, Italy. He then by 1946 is in Greece, and much of the translations for Greek date from this and earlier periods. Okay. Also, building the bridges between Gaelic culture and Scots, or Lowland culture. We have transcreations from Gaelic into English and Scots. And obviously, and of course, Arabic from his time in the Maghreb in North Africa. Okay, I'll just move this on. And just to point these out, I put these up, the first two, because the question of, how do poets, do they choose the language when they're multilingual? It's an interesting question, maybe only poets can answer. Angus Martin did who'd befriended him in the late 70s, early 80s, interviewed him in the early 80s, put the question directly to him and really got no answer except, I haven't a clue. I don't know how, it's automatic. I think he was reticent to talk about his own poetry. Anyway, Jello Mangan seems, in a very recent, fascinating article, seems to remember him actually discussing certainly translation in conversations. This is translation activity, which would have been interesting to be a fly in the wall for. And then another fascinating study, a very recent one, and I think Anne is actually here and could say more about it, taking at different perspectives on his work, but including looking at the effect of his health and what was diagnosed as schizophrenia, in which Dr. Hartmut argues would be more likely bipolar 2 disorder, and but the effects this has on his activity, and including the multilingual aspect. An absolutely fascinating read. So I'll leave it at that.